I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a solicitor's office, holding a piece of paper I had printed that morning. It was a title search document. Standard form. Black text on white paper. Nothing dramatic about it at all. Except my name wasn't on it. The family home, the one my parents had promised to both of us equally for as long as I could remember, had been transferred entirely into my sister's name. And at the bottom of the transfer document was my signature. A signature I never gave. I sat there for a long moment. Not shaking. Not panicking. Just still. Because here's the thing Karen didn't know, and couldn't have known. I had already been sitting in that same solicitor's office 3 weeks earlier. Not because I suspected anything specific. Not because I had proof of anything. Just because something had felt off. And I had learned a long time ago to trust that feeling. She thought I was unaware. She thought by the time I figured it out, it would already be too late to challenge. She had no idea the clock had already started, just not the one she was watching. But to understand why that moment in the car park felt like the end of a very long road, you need to know how it all began. My parents were not wealthy people. They worked hard their entire lives, kept their heads down, and by the time they reached their 60s, they had one real asset to show for it. The house, a semi-detached on a quiet street. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knows which car belongs to which driveway. 3 bedrooms. A small garden out back. Nothing remarkable to anyone who didn't grow up inside it. To me, it was everything. I learned to ride a bike on that street. Sat at that kitchen table for every birthday, every Christmas, every quiet Sunday that blurs into the background of childhood. Until one day, you realize those were the good years. My parents bought it in the early 80s. Single income. A lot of sacrifice. They paid it off slowly, carefully, the way people of that generation did. No shortcuts. No help. Just patience and discipline over decades. By the time Karen and I were adults, the mortgage was gone. The house was theirs. Fully and completely. My father never said he was proud of that outright. He didn't need to. You could see it in how he maintained the place. Fresh paint every few years. Gutters cleared before winter. The garden kept tidy even when his knees started making it difficult. Small things done consistently. Because the house represented something to him that went beyond bricks and tiles. It was proof. Proof that a quiet life, lived carefully, could amount to something real. My mother felt it differently. For her, the house was warmth. It was the smell of Sunday dinner filling the hallway. It was the particular creak of the 3rd stair that she never had fixed because she liked knowing when anyone was coming down in the night. It was 30 years of photographs on the same walls. Birthdays marked in pen on the inside of the kitchen cupboard door until we got too old for that to feel appropriate. That house held everything. Karen is 4 years older than me. We were never particularly close. Not in the way some siblings are. We didn't have some dramatic falling out. No single moment that defined things between us. It was more that we were just different. We moved through the world differently, wanted different things, measured success differently. She had always been focused on money in a way I found exhausting. Not ambitious exactly, more calculating, always aware of what things were worth. Always thinking a few steps ahead in any conversation that touched on finances, on property, on who owed what to whom. Even at family dinners, if the topic of house prices came up in conversation, Karen would engage in a way that felt slightly too interested, too attentive. I noticed it, but I told myself it was just her personality. Some people are simply wired that way. I had built a stable life of my own by my mid-30s. Logistics management. Not glamorous, but solid. Consistent work, consistent income, a role I understood well enough to do without it consuming me. I owned a small flat about 40 minutes from my parents. Nothing impressive, but mine. I had savings, a reliable car, a life that didn't depend on anyone else to hold it together. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. I was not waiting on an inheritance. I was not hovering around the family home like something I felt I was owed. The promise of an equal share meant something to me sentimentally. It was the family home. It carried memory and history and the particular weight of growing up somewhere. But I was not financially desperate for it. I had never factored it into my plans. Karen knew that, or she should have. My parents had mentioned the house to both of us a few times over the years. Nothing formal. No solicitor present. No paperwork signed in front of us. Just the kind of quiet conversations that happen between parents and adult children when everyone starts to acknowledge that time moves in one direction and it is better to be clear than to leave things unsaid. Dad said it clearly at the kitchen table one Sunday, maybe 3 years before any of this started. He said the house would go equally to both of us when the time came. 50-50. He looked at Karen when he said it, then at me. He wanted us both to hear it at the same time. No ambiguity. No favorites. Mom nodded from across the table. And that was that. The subject moved on within a minute, because that's how my parents handled anything that felt too heavy to sit with for long. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a properly drawn up, with a solicitor's stamp on it. It was a promise from two people who had spent their entire lives being honest, who trusted that their children would honor what they said. I believed them completely. I had no reason not to. Karen had always been more involved in my parents' day-to-day life than I was. Not because I was absent or careless, because she lived closer, 10 minutes from their door versus my 40. She helped with appointments, picked up shopping when the weather was bad, dealt with the small logistics of getting older that my parents were quietly starting to need help with. I was grateful for that. I told her so more than once. I thought she was being a good daughter. I thought she was doing what family does. Looking back now, I wonder when helpfulness became something else entirely. I wonder at what point she looked at the house and the access she had and the trust my parents placed in her and started doing the mathematics. I don't know exactly when it happened. I just know that by the time I started noticing the small things that didn't sit right, something had already been set in motion. The first thing I noticed was a comment my mother made. It was small. The kind of thing that disappears into a normal conversation if you're not paying attention. We were on the phone one evening, the usual check-in call, nothing significant. She mentioned that Karen had been helping them with some paperwork. I asked what kind of paperwork. She said she wasn't entirely sure. Something to do with the house, she thought. Karen had explained it all, and it had made sense at the time. I didn't push. My parents were in their 70s. Admin and legal language confused them easily. Karen helping them navigate something seemed reasonable on the surface. I said something like, "That's good of her," and the conversation moved on. But something about it stayed with me. Not loudly, just a low, quiet hum at the back of my mind. The kind you learn to pay attention to when you get older. A few weeks later, I visited for Sunday lunch. It was a normal afternoon. Roast dinner, the usual catch-up, my father watching something on television after we ate. At some point, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that they had signed some documents recently. I asked what documents. She looked uncertain, said Karen had brought them over and walked them through everything. Something about making sure the house was protected. She used that word, protected. I asked if they had spoken to a solicitor before signing anything. She said she thought Karen had handled all of that. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't want to alarm her. But inside, something shifted. I looked at my father. He was nodding slowly in the way he did when he wasn't entirely sure about something, but didn't want to admit it. He said Karen had been very thorough, very organized. He seemed almost proud of her for taking the initiative. I smiled and said that was good. And then I changed the subject. On the drive home, that evening, I turned it over in my mind. Documents related to the house, signed without a solicitor my parents had personally instructed. Karen explaining everything, managing the process, bringing the paperwork herself. None of that was necessarily wrong on its own. People help elderly parents with admin all the time. But the combination of details sat uncomfortably. The fact that my mother couldn't clearly explain what they had signed. The fact that my father's certainty seemed borrowed from Karen's confidence rather than his own understanding. Those things didn't sit right. I didn't call Karen. I didn't raise it with my parents again that evening. I just drove home and thought about it. Over the next few days, I did some basic reading online. Property transfer processes. How inheritance works when no formal will has been drawn up. What documents would typically be involved in transferring a title. What a person would need in order to move a property into someone else's name. The more I read, the more specific my unease became. Because transferring a property title isn't a small administrative task. It requires formal documentation. It requires signatures. It requires, in most cases, the knowledge and consent of everyone with a legal interest, which in this situation would include me. If my parents had verbally promised equal inheritance, if Karen was processing paperwork related to the house, and if my parents couldn't clearly explain what they had signed, then the question of where my name appeared in any of that documentation became very important. I want to be clear about something. At this point, I had no proof of anything, no document in front of me, no evidence of wrongdoing, just a feeling, and a set of facts that didn't quite add up. I could have called Karen and asked directly. I could have sat down with my parents and pushed for more details. But I had known Karen my entire life, and I understood something important about how she operated. If she had done something and I approached her without evidence, she would explain it away, calmly, confidently, with just enough plausibility to make me feel like I had overreacted. She was good at that. She always had been. So instead of saying anything to anyone, I made an appointment, a property solicitor, not a confrontation, not an accusation, just a conversation with someone who understood how these things worked legally. I told myself it was precautionary, and it was. But I also knew, sitting in the waiting room of that office on a Tuesday morning, that precautionary was exactly the right word. Because if I was wrong, no harm done. And if I was right, I needed to already be in the right place before I knew for certain. The solicitor was a calm, precise man in his 50s. He listened without interrupting. I explained the situation simply. Verbal promise of equal inheritance. Parents in their 70s. Sister with close access managing paperwork they couldn't clearly describe. He asked a few focused questions. Then he said something that made everything feel more serious. He said the first step was straightforward. Request a title search on the property. A current one. It would show exactly who was registered as the legal owner. It would show any recent transfers. It would show every name on the title and when any changes have been made. He said it with the calm tone of someone explaining something obvious. But I could tell from the way he said it that he already had a sense of where this might be going. I thanked him, paid for the consultation, and requested the title search that same afternoon. Then I went home and waited. Not anxiously, not dramatically, just quietly. The way you wait when you already suspect that what's coming is going to change things. And you've already decided that when it arrives, you'll be ready. The title search came back 4 days later. I printed it at home, sat down at the kitchen table with a coffee, and read it. The first page was standard. Property details. Address, land registry reference number, the kind of dry administrative language that means nothing until suddenly it means everything. I got to the ownership section, and I stopped. The property had been transferred. Recently, within the last 3 months. The registered owner was no longer my parents. It was Karen. Just Karen. Sole ownership. I read it again, then a third time. Because when something like that lands in front of you, your first instinct is that you've misread it, that the formatting is confusing, that there's a second page that explains it differently. There wasn't. The transfer was complete, registered, legal on its face. The family home, the one my parents had sat at the kitchen table and promised equally to both of us, had been moved entirely into my sister's name. Without my knowledge, without any conversation, without anyone telling me it had happened. I sat there for a long moment. The coffee went cold. I didn't notice. I kept looking at the document as if looking at it long enough would change what it said. It didn't. Then I turned to the supporting transfer documents that came with the search. Standard forms. The kind used in any property transfer. Signatures required from relevant parties. I scanned down to the witness and consent section, and there it was. My name, printed clearly, and next to it, a signature, A signature I did not recognize as mine. The shape of it was wrong. The way the letters connected was wrong. It carried none of the particular habits my own handwriting has built up over 40 years. But it was presented as mine, dated, witnessed, filed as part of a legal property transfer. I put the document down on the table, and I sat very still. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because it wasn't what most people might expect. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the kind of hot, immediate anger that makes you want to pick up the phone and start shouting. It was something quieter than that, something colder. It was a specific feeling of realizing that someone you have known your entire life looked at you and decided you didn't matter, that your name, your consent, your share of something that belonged to both of you was simply an obstacle to be removed, forged away, filed quietly, hoped to never be noticed. Karen had made a calculation. She had looked at the situation and decided that I was unlikely to check, that by the time I found out, if I ever did, the transfer would be long complete. Harder to challenge, easier to defend. She had probably told herself a story about it. People always do. Maybe she told herself she deserved it more. Maybe she told herself I didn't need it. Maybe she told herself she had done more for our parents, and this was simply balancing the books in a way they hadn't had the courage to do themselves. I don't know what the story was, but I know there was one. Because nobody does something like this in cold silence. You have to tell yourself something first. I picked the document back up. I looked at the signature again, and then I thought about the solicitor's office, the appointment I had made 3 weeks earlier, the title search he had suggested, the quiet, careful way he had listened and then pointed me in exactly the right direction. I had gone there without proof, just a feeling and a set of facts that didn't add up. And now I was sitting at my kitchen table holding the proof in my hands. I thought about calling my parents. For a moment, that instinct was strong. They needed to know. They had been manipulated. Documents put in front of them by someone they trusted completely, explained in whatever way made them feel comfortable enough to sign, while the full picture was kept carefully out of view. They deserved to know what had been done in their name. But I didn't call them. Not yet. Because I understood something important in that moment. Emotion moves fast, and fast was exactly what this situation didn't need. If I called my parents, they would call Karen, or Karen would find out some other way. And the moment she knew I had the title search, she would start preparing. Explanations, justifications, a version of events constructed carefully enough to create doubt. I'd seen her do it my entire life on smaller things. On something this significant, she would be formidable. So I did the only thing that made sense. I put the document in a folder, placed it carefully in the drawer of my desk, and I picked up the phone, not to call Karen, not to call my parents, to call the solicitor, because what I was holding wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was evidence, and evidence needed to be in the right hands before anything else happened. I left a message with his office that afternoon. Appointment requested. Urgent. I have the title search results. I need to come in. And then I closed the drawer, made a fresh coffee, and sat quietly with the weight of what I now knew, waiting for the moment to move. The solicitor saw me 2 days later. Same office, same calm, precise manner. I sat down across from him and placed the folder on the desk between us. He opened it, read through the title search, then the transfer documents. He didn't rush. He went through each page methodically, the way someone does when they're building a picture rather than just reading words. I watched him. His expression didn't change much, but at one point he stopped, looked more closely at the signature section. Then he looked up at me. He asked if that was my signature. I told him it was not. He nodded slowly, looked back down at the document, and then he said something very clearly. He said this was not just a civil dispute over inheritance. He said a signature had been falsified on a legal property transfer document. He said that was fraud, not a gray area, not a matter of interpretation. Fraud. The word sat in the room between us for a moment. I had known it was coming. I had understood it intellectually from the moment I saw the signature. But hearing a solicitor say it out loud made it real in a different way. He explained what would need to happen next. The forgery would need to be formally identified. A handwriting comparison could be commissioned if required. But more immediately, the legal challenge to the transfer could begin. Property transferred through fraudulent documentation can be reversed. It is not a simple process. It takes time. It requires the right paperwork filed in the right sequence. But it can be done. He said he had handled cases like this before. Not common, but not unheard of. I asked him what I should avoid doing. He was clear on that point. Do not contact Karen. Do not raise it with my parents yet. Do not discuss it with anyone who might mention it to her directly or indirectly. The moment Karen knew a legal challenge was coming, she could take steps. Complicate the process. Create noise. Potentially coach my parents into a version of events that muddied the picture. None of that would ultimately save her position given the evidence, but it could slow things down considerably. So silence was the strategy. Complete silence. I told him I understood, and I meant it. I left the office that afternoon with a clear list of next steps. Documents to gather, records to pull together, a timeline to reconstruct as precisely as possible. Every phone call with my mother where the paperwork had been mentioned. Every visit where my parents had referenced things Karen had helped them with. Every small detail that contributed to the larger picture. I went home and started that same evening. Not frantically, methodically. I went through my phone records first. Found the dates of the calls where my mother had mentioned documents and paperwork. I made notes. I wrote down the Sunday lunch where my mother had used the word protected. The look on my father's face. The way his certainty seemed borrowed from Karen's confidence. I wrote down everything I could recall in as much detail and with as accurate a timeline as I could construct. Then I went through my emails. Any correspondence that touched on the house or family finances. Anything that might help establish what my parents had understood and when. There wasn't a great deal. My family communicated mostly by phone and in person. But what there was, I gathered carefully. Over the following days, I met with the solicitor twice more. Each time I brought more material. Each time he reviewed it, added it to the file, and moved the process forward. He was building a case. Quietly, carefully, the way these things need to be built when they involve family and fraud in the same sentence. I found that process steadying. Actually, there is something about taking the right steps in the right order that removes a certain kind of anxiety. The situation was serious. What Karen had done was serious, but the path forward was clear, and as long as I stayed on it, the outcome would follow. During this time, I continued seeing my parents normally. Sunday lunches, phone calls, nothing different on the surface. Nothing that would signal to Karen that anything had changed. That was harder than it sounds. Sitting across from my father and talking about ordinary things while carrying the knowledge of what had happened. Watching my mother mention Karen's name warmly, gratefully, still believing that her older daughter had been helping. Still entirely unaware of what that help had actually looked like. I kept my face neutral, my voice even. I asked about their week. I talked about work. I stayed exactly as I had always been, because the worst thing I could do at that point was let anything show. Karen visited once during that period. I wasn't there, but my mother mentioned it on the phone afterward. Said Karen had seemed fine, normal, going about her life without any apparent concern. Of course she was. As far as Karen knew, I had no idea. She had transferred the property, filed the documents, and assumed the matter was settled. She was waiting for the moment I would eventually find out and have very little recourse. She had no idea that 3 weeks before I found that title search, I had already been sitting in a solicitor's office, and that everything she had done was already being reviewed by someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The legal challenge was filed on a Thursday morning. I didn't mark the occasion, didn't feel the need to. I just received a message from my solicitor confirming it had been submitted. I read it, put my phone down, and went back to what I was doing, because the next move wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the process, and the process was already in motion. The legal notice was served to Karen on a Wednesday. I know that because my solicitor confirmed it the same afternoon. A short message. Factual. Notice served and received. That was all. I read it once, then set my phone face down on the desk, and sat quietly for a moment. I thought about what that Wednesday morning would have looked like for her. Someone arriving at her door, or the envelope landing on her mat. Her name on the front, a solicitor's address in the top left corner. The particular weight of an envelope that carries something official inside. I thought about the moment she opened it. Read the first paragraph. Understood what it was. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. That's not quite the right word for it. It was something more like resolution. The quiet click of something finally moving into the correct position after a long time sitting wrong. According to my solicitor, Karen contacted her own legal representation within hours. That was expected. What followed over the next few days was less a confrontation and more an unwinding. The kind that happens when evidence is clear and the legal position of one party is significantly stronger than the other. Karen's solicitor made contact. There were questions about the documentation, about the timeline, about the signature. My solicitor answered each one with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. The forgery had been formally identified by this point. A handwriting analysis had been completed. The signature on the transfer document bore no consistent characteristics with my actual signature across multiple verified samples. That finding was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was documented, professional, and clear. Karen's legal position was not strong. It was not really a position at all. The transfer had been made using a falsified signature on a legal document. That fact did not have another side to it. There was no version of events in which that was acceptable or defensible. What she had counted on was time. She had counted on the transfer being so far complete by the time I discovered it that the practical and emotional cost of challenging it would deter me. She had counted on me being unaware until it was too late. And she had counted on the assumption that even if I found out, I might not know where to start. Every one of those assumptions had been wrong. I had found out early. I had already been to a solicitor before I even had the evidence, and I had followed every step of the legal process exactly as I had been advised. There was nothing for her position to rest on. During this period, my parents still didn't know the full picture. That was one of the more difficult parts of the process. They knew something was happening. Kara would have told them something. A version of events shaped to protect herself as much as possible. I don't know exactly what she said to them, but I know my mother called me during that week. Her voice was uncertain. She said Karen had mentioned some kind of legal misunderstanding. She asked if everything was all right. I told her gently that everything was being handled properly, that she didn't need to worry, that the right people were dealing with it. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said she trusted me, and we left it there. My father didn't call. That was actually harder. My father not calling told me more about how much Karen had managed to unsettle things than anything else could have. He was a man who called when things were straightforward. When they weren't, he went quiet. And he was quiet. I held on to the fact that the truth was already documented, already filed, already in the hands of people who understood how to present it properly. Whatever version of events Karen had given them, it wouldn't hold against what was already in the legal record. The weeks that followed moved at the pace these things move. Slowly, formally, with a lot of waiting between steps. My solicitor kept me informed at each stage. Updates came through in measured professional language. Progress being made. Responses received. Next steps confirmed. I went to work. I visited my parents. I kept my life exactly as it had been, because that was the right thing to do. Not because it was easy, because disrupting my own life while the process ran its course would have served no purpose at all. There were moments, quiet ones, usually late in the evening when the day had wound down, where the full weight of what Karen had done would settle over me. Not anger, something sadder than anger. Grief, almost, for the version of a family that doesn't do things like this to each other. For my parents, for the trust they had placed in her so completely. For the particular sadness of loving someone and discovering that they saw you as an obstacle. I let those moments exist without pushing them away. And then I moved on. Because the process was running. The evidence was clear, and the outcome was already taking shape. I just had to stay steady until it arrived. Then, one afternoon, my solicitor called rather than messaged. He said the court had reviewed the challenge and the supporting evidence. He said the outcome was looking certain. He said I should prepare for the final stage. I thanked him, put the phone down, and, for the first time in months, I exhaled properly, because it was almost over, and Karen was about to find out exactly how far back it had all started. The court ruled to reverse the transfer. It wasn't a close decision. It wasn't a matter of competing arguments being carefully weighed against each other. The documentation was clear. The forgery was formally established. The transfer had been made using a falsified signature on a legal property transfer document. The court reversed it. The property was returned to my parents' names, both of them, where it had always legally belonged. Karen faced formal consequences for the forgery. I won't go into every detail of that process, but I will say that the legal system took it seriously, as it should. Falsifying a signature on a property transfer document is not a minor administrative error. It is not a technicality. It is not something that can be explained away with the right framing. It is fraud, and it was treated as such. Her solicitor had done what solicitors do in those situations: argued for mitigation, presented circumstances, tried to soften the edges of something that didn't have soft edges. It didn't change the finding. It only shaped what came after it. The harder part was my parents. They were told the full picture once the legal process had reached a point where it could be clearly explained without risk of interference. My solicitor helped me think through how to approach that conversation. We decided it was best done in person, quietly, just the three of us. I drove to the house on a Saturday morning. The same drive I had made hundreds of times. The same streets. The same turn onto their road. The same view of the front garden as I pulled up. My father's car in the driveway. The curtains in the front room already open. Everything exactly as it always looked. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. Not because I was nervous exactly, but because I understood that what was about to happen inside that house would change something permanently. And I wanted to be steady when it did. I went in, sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where my father had told us both, years earlier, that the house would go equally to his children. 50-50. He had meant it. I had always known he had meant it. I walked them through everything, calmly, without drama, without editorializing Karen's choices or telling them how to feel about what she had done. I just presented the facts in sequence. The paperwork they had signed without fully understanding. The title search. The transfer. The signature in my name that I had never given. The legal process that had followed. The outcome. I placed the documents on the table as I went through each point, so they could see them. So it wasn't just words from me. So the truth was sitting there in front of them in black and white. My mother cried, not loudly. The quiet kind of crying that happens when something breaks inside a person too slowly for them to stop it. She kept saying she hadn't known. She kept saying she had trusted Karen completely. She kept looking at the documents, as if looking at them long enough would offer some other explanation. There wasn't one. I told her I knew that. I told her that was exactly why it had happened the way it did. Karen had known how much they trusted her, and she had used that trust with precision. My father didn't cry. He sat very still, the way he had sat still my entire life when something was too large to respond to immediately. He is a man who processes things slowly and privately, who takes weight seriously enough not to react to it quickly. He looked at the table for a long time, at the documents, at his hands. Then he looked at me, and he said he was sorry, not for what Karen had done. He couldn't speak to that yet. He said he was sorry that I had carried this alone for so long without telling them. That undid me more than almost anything else in the whole process, because he was right. I had carried it alone, by necessity, by design, because the process required it, but it had been heavy in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. And having him name that without being asked meant more than I can properly explain. We sat at that table for a long time. longer than any previous conversation we had ever had about anything difficult. My mother asked questions. Some of them I could answer clearly. Some of them about Karen's motivations, about when exactly she had decided to do what she did. I couldn't answer because I genuinely didn't know. I told them that honestly. I wasn't going to speculate about Karen's interior world to fill the gaps. What I knew, I told them. What I didn't know, I said so. My father asked if there had been any point at which I had considered just letting it go, not pursuing the legal challenge, choosing family peace over a formal process. I thought about that question carefully before answering, because it deserved a careful answer. I told him that letting it go would not have been peace. It would have been surrender, and it would have left my parents in a situation where a document existed with a forged signature in my name. That document would have defined the legal reality of this family going forward. I couldn't let that stand, not for my own sake, but for theirs. He nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when something landed properly. Karen and my parents went through their own process after that conversation. That is their story to tell, not mine. What I can say is that it was not clean or simple or resolved quickly. My parents loved Karen. They still loved her even after everything. Love doesn't switch off because someone has done something wrong. It just gets complicated, painfully, permanently complicated. I didn't push them toward any particular position. I didn't ask them to cut contact with her. I didn't ask them to take sides in any visible way. What had needed to happen legally had already happened. The house was back where it belonged. The truth was on a record. That was enough. Karen and I have not spoken since the legal notice was served. I don't know if we ever will. There is a version of the future where some kind of conversation happens, where something is said that allows both of us to exist in the same family space again without it being unbearable. I don't know if that version is realistic. I'm not sure it matters right now. What I know is that I don't carry anger toward her. I have tried to examine that honestly because I think it's worth being honest about. And what I find when I look for the anger is mostly just sadness. Sadness that she made the choices she made. Sadness for what it cost my parents. Sadness for the version of a family that might have existed if she had simply let things be. The house is still there, on that quiet street. My parents are still in it. My father still clears the gutters before winter. My mother still has the photographs on the same walls. The third stair still creaks. Some things stay exactly as they are regardless of what tries to move them. I think about that sometimes, about the fact that all of it, the forgery, the legal process, the months of quiet and careful work, ultimately ended with things being what they should have been all along. No dramatic shift, no new arrangement, just the correct outcome, the one that should never have needed fighting for. I did everything through the right channels. I didn't confront anyone prematurely. I didn't make accusations without evidence. I didn't let emotion drive decisions that needed to be driven by process. I went to a solicitor before I even had proof of anything. Just a feeling and a set of facts that didn't add up. And that one quiet, careful step changed everything. Because by the time the evidence arrived, I was already in the right place to use it. If there's anything the whole experience left me with, it is this. When something feels wrong, take it seriously. Not loudly, not reactively, quietly and seriously. Get proper advice from the right people. Follow the right steps in the right order. And trust that doing things correctly, even when it is slow and costly and lonely, tends to arrive at the right place. That is all I did. Nothing dramatic, nothing clever, just the right steps in the right order at the right time. And it was enough. Sometimes the saddest wins are still wins. And learning to hold both of those things at once is its own kind of peace. If any part of this story stayed with you, the patience of it, the importance of taking that first quiet step before you even have proof, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the next story, it is already waiting for you.